This here is the story of the King Killer Star, a spell so powerful it would curse dragonkind for tens of thousands of years. Once upon a time, during a period known as the Time of Dragons, there existed a beautiful city named Dawnfire, led by a majestic golden dragon. It was the capital of a vast draconic kingdom, and this was deep, deep into the past. I'm talking around the year negative 25,000 DR. The Time of Dragons is called that because during this period the giants, and primarily the dragons, sought to depose the ancient creator races and establish themselves as the authority of the land. And as such, they would launch devastating attacks against these progenitor races. Empires throughout the land crumbled under the flight of the dragons, destroying those nations in their entirety. They would also clash against the giants over territory, but that's outside of the scope of this entry. Anyhow, during this time, the lesser races of humans and demi-humans were enslaved by the dragon lords. They were authoritarian taskmasters, one and all. Although it does appear that the metallic dragons were quite a bit less brutal than their chromatic brethren. In fact, a key character in today's story is a metallic golden dragon, and you'll see just how they treat even those who serve them faithfully. The Time of Dragons came to an end, however, after the first rage of dragons had devastated their civilizations, allowing elves to begin building their first empires on Faerun. But don't let me get ahead of myself. Earlier I mentioned the city of Dawnfire, because that's where this whole story begins. So let's start there. The city of Dawnfire was the capital of an impossibly ancient kingdom. The city itself was built as a singular large castle seemingly carved from the very peak of the mountaintop on which it existed. A wonder to the eye, the entire place was decorated tastefully, grabbing one's attention especially at sunrise. There was but a single road from the base of the mountain all the way up to the castle proper. And in this castle lived their ruler, King Orchtrien. And I'm but a simple ex-adventurer, so apologies if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. Orchtrien's personal palace was a hive-like structure with a great door at the front, and smaller doors to the side to allow for human-sized guests and attendants. King Orchtrien was perhaps best defined by a combination of good cheer, overconfidence, but also a reckless disregard for the feelings of others. At the time, he was already hundreds of years old and had just put down a rebellion consisting of a few elven houses. One of the king's advisors, Respin Ash, an elven mage, would go on to petition the king to treat the rebels with leniency, and the king did indeed accept Ash's request. So instead, as punishment, the king would take an heir from each rebellious house and take them into his care, thinking this would motivate the houses to be on their best behavior. And truthfully, it did work for a time. Ash would go on to meet with these hostages, which included a new character to our story, Winterflower Duskmere, an elven noblewoman and heir to House Duskmere. She had curly black hair, gold-flecked blue eyes, and fair skin. Her exquisite features added up to a look of courage and intelligence, both of which she had in spades. She was known to behave in extremes, being cold to some and friendly to others. This was deliberate on her part, as it was a way to manage the attentions of the men around her. After being taken in by the king, his advisor Respin would act as her mentor, but over time he found himself growing attached to the fair elven woman, as she was impossibly charming and a talented mage to boot. Her singing was known throughout the land, and one day she was invited to a feast by the king, where she would be asked to sing for the gathering. This would actually happen on 2 occasions, and on the second time she must have also caught the eye of the king himself. So now there was a brewing love triangle between Respin, Winterflower, and the king, despite Respin asking him not to pursue her. And as one might guess, Respin's wish would not be granted this time around. Now, you might already be wondering why I'm talking about a rebellion and this love triangle, but I assure you it is relevant to the topic at hand, so let's continue on. After making his request, Respin would coincidentally be sent away to do some winter raiding, an especially deadly task at the time. But to make a long story short, Respin would return the next year having fought through many skirmishes, including personally defeating a green dragon himself. As a side note, during the battle, Respin reached out to the king for assistance via a sending spell, and heard nothing in response. However, once he got back to Dawnfire, that would be the least of his concerns, because upon his arrival in the city, he would sadly learn that Winterflower had become the king's consort, understandably breaking Respin's heart. But during the celebration, Respin would catch eyes with the maiden and swear that he saw signs of distress on her face. So at that moment, he decided he would take it upon himself to find out the truth. He would go to her one night and sneak inside her quarters by charming the guard outside of her door. Inside, he talked to her and she told him that she was under the effect of a charm spell a majority of the time, and that she was only lucid every so often. So with this in mind, Respin would sneak into the king's laboratory at the top of the tower, looking for a way to dispel the charm. After searching, he managed to find a great spell of unbinding, which appeared to be sufficient to break the magic on Winterflower. However, he was caught shortly thereafter. This would cause a bit of an unintended distraction, which allowed Winterflower to seize some of the king's spellbooks, Respin's Quicksilver Staff, and teleport away to safety. The same could not be said about Respin, however. He was dragged into the dungeon and tortured for a time, but luckily for him, he was able to summon his staff through sheer force of will, and eventually escape to the rebel base, where Winterflower was hiding. That is, until King Orchtrien arrived with his army and began to assail their walls. This resulted in Respin holding off the king's forces for a while, giving the rebels enough time to scatter, along with the copies of the king's spellbooks. And sadly, Respin would not survive the encounter, but Winterflower managed to be the only runner who escaped away to safety, and on her person those aforementioned spellbooks. Or at least that's what they assumed. The truth is, the arcane knowledge in those books weren't spells at all. The books actually contained information on the relationship between dragons and the fundamental forces of the world. Information that would aid Winterflower in the creation of the Dracorage Mythal. Now that's a new term for us, isn't it? So what is it? A mythal is simply another name for an incredibly powerful magical effect created by a group of spellcasters over a large area. Mythals can permanently alter the weave in the area, wherein the standard rules of magic no longer apply. The Dracorage Mythal is just a specific mythal created by Winterflower once she escaped away to safety, using the arcane tomes taken from King Orchtrien. Because, as you might imagine, Winterflower held a lot of disdain in her heart towards dragonkind, because at the time the elves just wanted to rule themselves, which is completely understandable. So, with this motivation, she would go on to target all dragonkind with the mythal's effects. Now, I'm unable to tell you precisely what Winterflower had to do to cast this kind of spell. It's way beyond my skill level, even in my prime. You'll hear magic of this caliber referred to as epic magic by modern mages. Epic magic is a specific type of magic that extends way beyond what we know today. In fact, after an event known as Karsus's Folly, the goddess of magic would place specific limitations on this level of magecraft. Everything from damaging the mage whenever they read the glyphs, to physically draining the caster and them losing grasp of their greatest spells. These limitations make it so that only the most ambitious or insane mages will even think of trying to harness this amount of power. But there are whispers that a select few mages on Faerun still hold the knowledge needed to cast these spells successfully. But I think that's a tale for another time. Let's get back to Winterflower and her revenge against the dragons that wronged her. The Dracorage Mythal encompassed roughly 250,000 square miles in the far, far north of Faerun, supposedly near the northern pole of our world. And above this area was a reddish comet that would eventually come to be known as the King Killer Star. Now, we don't know the exact effects of the mythal cast by Winterflower, but what we do know is after its creation, dragonkind would descend into recklessness and wanton violence at just the sight of this celestial body. In fact, the name King Killer Star would originate from King Orchtrien witnessing the red comet and instantly entering into a rage, attacking his own loyal subjects, who were eventually forced to slay him in self-defense. And in Orchtrien's last moments, he would claim that the red star had murdered him. This kind of draconic rage actually has a name. They call it a rage of dragons. Quite original, I know. And this instance wasn't even the last time this would happen. In fact, the King Killer Star would periodically visit Faerun and have similar effects each and every time. During a rage, pressure would build in every dragon's mind, which gradually reduced their capacity for reason and judgment. They could fight it for a time, but it slowly built day by day until even the most powerful dragons would be made insane. Generally, this madness would last for about 30 to 40 days, but could easily last longer under the right conditions. There were no known effective countermeasures either, although it is thought that a dragon could put themselves into a deep sleep while the red comet was visible, and that might slow the rage, but this is unconfirmed. Dragons would find themselves becoming more unhinged and less concerned with morality until the King Killer Star passed by, or until the dragon found their way out of the area effect of the spell. However, overall, the damage had already been done. The dragons would never again hold the amount of power they did during the time of dragons, and this is exclusively attributed to the King Killer Star. They simply couldn't maintain their kingdoms when every so often they would go into a murderous rage and wreck everything they had built, and the few decades of peace in between would be insufficient for them to ever fully recover. So time would go on, and the Mythal would continue its hold on the dragons of Faerun. This cycle would continue every few decades up until about the year 1373. At that time, it had been discovered by a powerful lich who had hijacked the Mythal so he could use the power for himself. And from what I understand, this lich was using the Mythal as his phylactery, using it to protect him from destruction. But there would be unintended consequences, because this, in turn, would instigate the final Rage of Dragons, which would carry on for almost a full year, which was completely unprecedented at the time. The mass destruction wrought by this event drew the attention of adventurers like yourselves across the face of Faerun. It's unclear to me the exact details of how or when the Lich and the Mythal were sundered, but they eventually were, freeing the Lich from perpetual undeath, and also destroying the Dracorage Mythal that had stood for so many eons. And so fell the King Killer Star and its death grip on dragonkind. This was approximately 125 years ago, and we haven't had a rage in all these many years, so I think it's safe to say that that cycle is complete for now. The amount of damage this spell caused is incalculable, but perhaps it was a blessing for folks like you and I, because I don't believe we could have ever come to an agreement with the ancient dragonkind. That is to say, I don't think they would have ever allowed us lesser beings to rule ourselves. Now, am I saying that it's impossible for it to ever come back? No, but truthfully, it seems very unlikely to me. I feel as though Mistra might have something to say about if any modern mages wanted to use the weave the same way Winterflower and her associates did so very long ago. And that brings our tale to a close. If you made it all the way to the end, truly thank you. Stories like these are long, winding, and ancient for a reason, and it means a lot that you chose to walk this road with me. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the time of dragons, let me know with a like and a comment, or a share, or a subscription. It helps me more than you know. Until next time, keep your spells prepared, your curiosity sharp, and your eyes on the skies. You never know when a red star might return. So be safe, take care, and happy trails.